Hi everyone, my name is Catherine Moravec and I work for Colorado Springs Utilities as a Senior Water Conservation Specialist. Welcome to WaterWise Landscaping for Beginners. This is going to be a great webinar for those of you that are new to landscaping, as well as those of you that are new to landscaping in the Colorado Springs area. So let's get right into it. The first thing I want to tell you is that it is possible to create a water-wise landscape that you love. It is doable with what we know and the resources that we have to create a landscape that is beautiful and usable and is water-wise all at the same time. Colorado Springs Utilities has a wide variety of resources to help you with all of your landscaping projects. Here's what I'm going to be talking about in the webinar today. First, I'll share with you some information about Colorado Springs' climate. Then I'll talk about the top 5 not so successful approaches that we see in landscapes. And then I'll share with you 2 frameworks for water-wise landscaping. And then I'll share with you some photographs of successful approaches that people have used in local landscapes. Then I'll share some tips with you about working with landscape contractors, and then some practical suggestions about how you can get started working on your own yard. So let's go ahead and get started with Colorado Springs' climate. This is a picture of what Colorado Springs looked like in the early days. And you can see from this photograph that trees were naturally growing on the mountains and the foothills, but they really didn't grow east of that. What was growing was short native grasses. And that's because in Colorado Springs, we naturally get about 13 inches of precipitation from rain, and then another 3 inches of precipitation as snow during the winter. And so the vegetation that is able to be sustained on that amount of precipitation is short native grasses. So if we want to plant other plants around our homes and businesses to enhance our community, then we have to water them with irrigation water. In the Pikes Peak region, water is a critical, life-sustaining resource. We use it for drinking, flushing the toilet, bathing, doing laundry, but we also use it to sustain all the beautiful vegetation that we plant around our homes and businesses to enhance the quality of life in our community. Colorado Springs is a little unique amongst other Front Range cities in that it's not located next to a major river. So you can see that Colorado Springs in this picture is the yellow star, and it's actually not close to a river at all, except for Fountain Creek and Monument Creek, which are smaller waterways. The water that flows through these creeks really isn't enough to sustain our community. So the founders of our community had to look for larger, more reliable water sources. And they were able to find a reliable water source for Colorado Springs as high mountain snow. When this snow melts in the spring, then our water system collects that water, stores it, and then transports it to town for the uses that we need. This is a picture that shows you just how extensive our water system is. Colorado Springs is located right over here, and you can see that we have 3 major pipelines that bring water to town. 2 of these pipelines bring water from west of the Continental Divide all the way to our local storage system that sustains our community. We have an extensive system of pipes and reservoirs and pump stations to bring the water to town that we need. In Colorado Springs, more than half of all water sales that are provided by Colorado Springs Utilities are for residential properties. So this is a pie chart that shows how a typical household uses water throughout the year. And what you can see is that 35% of the water use of a typical household is actually used to support landscaping. So even though it's important for us to have high efficiency toilets, high efficiency shower heads, and to address leaks that occur in our homes and businesses, landscaping provides probably the most significant opportunity for us to become more water efficient as a community. Now, our community has been doing really well in terms of becoming more efficient. In general, water use has declined by 25% since the late 1990s. But we still have more opportunity to become more water wise, and that's where we need your help. So now I'm going to be sharing with you the top 5 not so successful landscaping approaches that we see in our community. In the 1980s and 90s, it was really common for new homes to be landscaped with large, extensive lawns, a few trees, and a few shrubs. And what we found over time is that these large, expansive lawns are expensive to maintain. The reason for that is that Kentucky bluegrass, which is the most common lawn grass that's used in the Pikes Peak region, needs 20 gallons of water per square foot during the growing season from April to October. And that 20 gallons is on top of what we get from precipitation naturally. So Kentucky bluegrass is just naturally adapted to grow in a wetter climate than what we have naturally here in Colorado Springs. And when you add up that amount of water use over a growing season, over a large landscape, then it just becomes expensive. In an effort to reduce the water and maintenance requirement of landscapes, some people have removed all the vegetation from their yard and put in unplanted rock. Even though this sounds like a good idea at the time, what we found is that it really makes a yard completely unusable. In addition, we've also seen that over time, weeds and debris will accumulate in the rock, making the maintenance needs of that landscape increase. So even though this may buy you a few years of low maintenance, over the long term, it's not really a solution that benefits our community. Another common landscape approach that we see not be so successful in Colorado is that when people move to Colorado Springs from other areas of the country, they may have certain plants that worked really well in the previous location in which they lived. Maybe azaleas, rhododendrons, or euonymus were some of their favorite plants. But when they put those plants in the low humidity, hot, dry, and cold climate of Colorado Springs, those plants do not perform well. The good news is there's a wide variety of really attractive, water-wise plants that thrive in the Colorado Springs area. And I'll be sharing with you some resources about where you can find those plants for yourself. Another common problem that we see is that people will go out and purchase plants and plant them without having an automatic watering system in place. I've done it myself. I go to the nursery or garden center in the spring. I see these attractive plants. I purchase them and take them home. And then I hand water them for a while. And then if I go on a trip and we have an extended dry period, I come home to crispy, dead plants. So what we want to do is encourage you to make sure that before you make an investment in purchasing plants, you have a watering system that can sustain those plants when you can't water them yourself. Another common mistake that we see people making is not preparing the soil before they lay sod. The soils in Colorado are naturally low in organic matter, and if you just lay sod on top of our natural soils, you'll end up with a lawn that experiences drought stress and doesn't thrive over time. The good news is that it's a very easy thing to do to prepare the soil before you lay sod. All you have to do is go and purchase some good quality compost, spread it out over the area that you're going to plant, and mix it into the soil before you plant your grass. If you prepare the soil before you plant, you can end up with a healthy, strong lawn that'll bring a lot of value to your landscape. For the rest of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about water-wise landscaping. Rather than being a particular style of landscaping, water-wise landscaping is simply an approach that's based on landscaping techniques that have proven to work in our climate, wise plant choices, efficient watering equipment, and efficient scheduling for your watering system. Once you have all these pieces working together, you can create virtually any style of landscape that you like. So now let's talk about frameworks for water-wise landscaping. Now that we've talked about what a water-wise landscape is, let's talk about the 2 frameworks that work really well here in the Pikes Peak region. The first framework is making a traditional type of landscape as water efficient as possible. So if you've heard about the 7 principles of Xeriscape, that's what this approach is based upon. The second approach is much more naturalistic or xeric in that it uses plants that are very drought tolerant. And that's the basis of this approach. And if you go down this path, you're going to landscape in a different way than if you use the 7 principles of Xeriscape. So let's talk about the water-wise traditional landscape. If you use this framework, then you're going to fundamentally work with hydrozones. What that means is you're going to be grouping plants by water need in different areas of your landscape. If you want to include turfgrass in your landscape, this is the approach to use. Because turfgrass is a higher water use plant, and you'll want to limit the size of the turfgrass that you have in your yard and use efficient irrigation to water it. Now with this approach, you can have high water use plants in your landscape as long as you keep their size reasonable and water them efficiently. In the other areas where you don't have turfgrass, you can have plant beds that might be moderate water use plants or low water use plants, but you want to group them by water need and use drip irrigation and some sort of mulch or gravel to cover the soil between the plants. On the other hand, this second framework that's available, this naturalistic or xeric approach, really is based much more upon choosing very xeric and oftentimes native plants. Sometimes that will include having a section of native grass rather than turf grass, or it might be a landscape that doesn't include any grass at all. But because all of the plants are chosen that have a very low water requirement, these types of landscapes can be watered once a month to once per week. So there's significant water savings with this type of approach. In addition, naturalistic or xeric landscapes are very resilient to drought because the water requirements of the plants that are included in the landscape are so low. So if we go into water restrictions, most of these types of landscapes don't show any negative effects at all. Either framework can be successful in the Colorado Springs area, but I would recommend that you choose one or the other as you begin to work on your landscape. And the reason is that choosing a framework will help you make better decisions when it comes to including edging or not in your landscape, how you're going to lay out the irrigation, whether or not to improve the soil, and what type of plants that you're going to be choosing. It's up to you to choose the approach that's going to work best for you. Just be aware that these two frameworks exist. If you're looking for more information about how to design your landscape, we have 2 upcoming webinars that might interest you. The first one is on April 15th. That's going to cover water-wise landscape design, or how to use the 7 principles of Xeriscape to make a more traditional landscape water-wise. The other webinar that will focus on design will be on May 6th. This webinar will focus on designing a drought-resistant landscape, where we'll cover really how to create a naturalistic or xeric landscape. In this section, I'm going to be showing you a lot of examples of successful landscapes. I'm not going to be going into the details of how to design and install these types of landscapes. That's for our future webinars. But what I really want to achieve is to spark your creativity and show you some examples of what's possible. And we're going to start off with successful traditional water-wise landscapes. Here's an example of a yard that is very simple and very effective. Here it's got a small area of turf grass in the front yard, and then they have a series of small plant beds, one here on the corner, another one above this retaining wall, and a few ornamental grasses planted on this side of the grass. In addition, they've also put some plants in between the sidewalk and the parkway, rather than putting turf grass in this area. So because they've limited the area of turf grass and they're watering it efficiently, this can be a very successful approach to landscaping in the Pikes Peak region. They've also done a nice job of creating a walkway around to the side yard. They've also done a nice job of using either wood mulch or gravel to cover the bare soil in between the plants. This is a simple landscape, but it works really well. Here's a view from the street where you can see how this landscape really enhances the front of this home. And by keeping it simple, it looks unified and tidy and works really well. So this is certainly something that works in the Pikes Peak region successfully. In this landscape, I want to show you the backyard. So here's the gate that takes you to the rear of this home. And you can see in this landscape that they have a moderate size of turf grass in this portion of the yard. But the majority of the area in the landscape is covered by wood mulch. And that can be very effective because wood mulch works really well to suppress weeds, which can keep your maintenance low. So in this wood mulch, they've created some plant beds in this area and have some ornamental grasses over here. But they've also used the mulch to serve as a ground cover for some of their living spaces right here around this fire pit. So in this area, you can see once again the turf grass here and the perimeter of shrubs that have been planted in the wood mulch, but they've also included a shed for functional space and a beautiful patio for outdoor dining. The nice thing about including some patio space is that you don't have to water it. So if you use the model of having about a third of your yard be turf grass, a third be planting beds, and a third as living space, that's a really good model that you can use to create a water-wise landscape that's usable and functional, but still is affordable in terms of your water bill. Here's another example of a backyard where they've used the same model of having a small patch of turf grass in this area. They have some plant beds over here, but in addition, they have this really attractive patio. Not only are they using that for relaxation and outdoor dining, but they've also put in a hammock here that makes this a beautiful place to relax during the summer. The grass is watered with efficient spray heads, and the perimeter is mulched and planted. Here's another shot of that same landscape, and you can see that they've created a functional space here with additional parking. And looking at it from the other direction, you can see a better view of the patio here and this large plant bed on the other side of the patio. And you can see how that plant bed really enhances the landscape of the backyard. Here's a landscape that is much larger but uses the same approach. An area of turf grass, an area of plant beds, and then some functional unirrigated areas. In this case, we have a driveway that is serving as the unirrigated area. They have some large plant beds and they have a turf grass area over here. Now compared to the other two landscapes, this landscape is much larger. And if you have a larger landscape, then you are going to need to use larger plants to fill up some of that space. Looking from the other direction, you can see how they've really done a great job choosing water-wise plants for their plant beds. Here with catmint and here with some low-growth sumac, which turns bright red in the fall. This is the interior courtyard of this landscape, which is really a showcase garden. In this area, they have done a wonderful job selecting plants with a variety of textures and colors and foliage to create a very interesting, beautiful garden that's really close to the home. The reason I wanted to show you this particular garden is that it is absolutely possible to get color and texture and beauty from water-wise plants. So now that I've shared with you a few traditional landscapes based on the 7 principles of xeriscape, I'd like to move on to showing you some successful xeric or naturalistic landscapes that include native grass instead. Here's an example of a landscape that my coworker built that looks very similar to some of the water-wise landscapes we saw in the previous pictures. It's got some retaining walls to level out the slope, and they have some really attractive plant beds at this level. They've also put ground covers, flowers, and ornamental grasses between the sidewalk and the curb, as well as some stepping stones. But rather than using traditional turf grass in this area, they've used a native grass called buffalo grass. This grass uses much less water than Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass typically has to be watered 3 times per week during the growing season, compared to buffalo grass, which only needs to be watered once per week. So the irrigation system in this landscape is going to look very similar to a more traditional landscape, but the difference being that this spray irrigation in this area is going to be scheduled much less often than it would for a traditional lawn. Here's a close-up of the area between the sidewalk and the curb. Rather than putting grass in this area, they've made this into a beautiful garden that really enhances the curb appeal of the home. Now, this type of parkway is not for everyone because it is going to require cutting those plants back in the spring and doing some weeding, but it is a great example of how water-wise plants can really be attractive and enhance the curb appeal of your property. Here's another example of a landscape in Colorado where they've used a different native grass. Rather than using buffalo grass, they've used blue grama, which is a native grass that grows throughout Colorado in this section of the yard. And even though it's a little bit longer and a little bit more naturalistic looking, it is serving somewhat as a grass area. In the other portion of the yard on this side, they've used water-wise flowers, ground covers, and ornamental grasses to create a beautiful plant bed right next to the driveway and entry of the home. There is a small retaining wall that they built right here up against the driveway and also on the back side of this plant bed to give a little bit of elevation change for this plant bed. But once again, you can see how you can get such a variety of color and textures with water-wise plants. Here's an interesting example of a landscape where they've really taken a naturalistic approach. So they've included buffalo grass up towards the home in this area, but rather than confining all the perennial flowers and ornamental grasses to plant beds with edging, instead, this amazing gardener has actually begun to mix the flowers and shrubs and grasses into the grass areas. And you can see that because all of these plants have a similar water requirement, meaning they could be watered once per week or less, then you don't have to confine your flowers to their own area. You can start to mix them in to the landscape and create a much more naturalistic and wildflower look. This is a very successful example of how you could transition a landscape from the area close to the home and make it more naturalistic and less maintained as it transitions into open space or natural areas. And what a beautiful example of a gorgeous landscape. Here's another xeric or naturalistic landscape that includes a grass area. This is buffalo grass here, but they've taken a much more naturalistic and simple approach. They've limited the types of plants that they've included into this landscape to 3 or 4 shrubs and smaller perennial flowers. And then they've left this buffalo grass in this area mostly unirrigated. If you do that, then the buffalo grass will be green when we have lots of rain, and if we have a dry period, it will be brown. It's not dead, it's just going dormant. And you can see how they've also started to work these shrubs and flowers in with the buffalo grass without a traditional plant bed edging to create a much more naturalistic landscape. So now that I've shown you some pictures of xeric or naturalistic landscapes with grass, I want to show you some similar landscapes that don't include any grass at all. So here's an example of a Colorado Springs home that has a beautiful retaining wall right here, and then they've created plant beds with shrubs and ornamental grasses to keep the maintenance low. And in this type of landscape, this is where you would traditionally see a lawn area. But instead of using a lawn grass or a native grass, they've instead used a ground cover to cover the soil in this area. This works really well because rather than having a wide variety of plants in this area that creates a lot of visual interest, they've created a much more uniform, calming area that it really enhances this plant bed. The good news is that if you use a successful water-wise ground cover, you don't have to mow it. Now you will have to do some weeding in the little gaps in between the plants, but if you enjoy weeding more than you do mowing, this might be a good option for you. Another good thing about using a ground cover is that most of them will bloom for a couple weeks during the summer. This is the same home, and you can see that their thyme ground cover is in bloom here, where you can actually get some additional color and interest in your landscape. Here's another landscape that works really well and doesn't include any grass. It's a smaller landscape than the one I showed you previously, but kind of uses the same model. Once again, there's a retaining wall that includes a much simpler palette of ornamental grasses and shrubs. And then in front of that retaining wall, they have an area of solid ground cover. In this landscape, they've also taken out the grass in the parkway, but they have included some beautiful flagstone stepping stones, a small retaining wall here, and then a simple planting of ornamental grasses, ground covers, and a tree. By using just a few different types of plants, you can create a very calming, peaceful feeling landscape that is also water-wise. This is the backyard of the same home. And you can see that rather than having a third of turf grass, a third of living space, and a third of plant beds, they've eliminated the turf grass and expanded the living space to include multiple uses. So they have a really attractive leisure area right over here, and then they have outdoor dining over here. And the good news is that all of this patio area doesn't require any water, but is still very functional, especially with this gorgeous pergola. They have included some really nicely done plant beds to make this area beautiful and enjoyable as well. Here's a close-up of those plant beds, and you can see they built a beautiful retaining wall here with a couple different levels and included water-wise plants and a few art pieces to really enhance this seating area. Here's another landscape that is much more naturalistic in its style. So rather than having organized groups of plants with well-defined plant beds, it has a few retaining walls to create a border between the natural area and the landscaped area. And then they have chosen a few different types of plants that they've repeated throughout the landscape. But they have really mixed these plants together and spread them out to create a beautiful naturalistic type of style. The way that they've been able to tie this all together and make it look very professional is by still limiting the number of different types of plants. So you can see that this ornamental grass is repeated here, 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 and here. And this yellow moonshine yarrow, you can see it here, 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 and here, and here. So they've limited the number of plants, but they've mixed them up to create a much more informal appearance. And this works really well for landscapes, especially those that border open spaces or natural areas. Here's a planting area between the fence and the driveway in the same landscape, and you can see how they've created a beautiful border of water-wise rabbit brush, moonshine yarrow, and Russian sage. By repeating these plants throughout this long planting area, they have created a lot of unity and a lot of visual appeal in the landscape. But because all of these plants are very water-wise, they can get away with watering this area once every couple of weeks. So now that we've looked at some examples of successful landscapes, let's move on to working with landscape contractors. This is the typical landscape installation process. So if a contractor is going to help you take your project from start to finish, these are the 8 steps that they typically will undertake. First, design the hardscape, irrigation, and plants. Demolish any type of landscaping that needs to be removed. Then if there's soil levels that need to be changed, they'll do rough grading. Then they'll move on to hardscape and irrigation installation. The hardscape is really just boulders, pathways, walls, all of the hard parts of the landscape that are not plants. And in this phase, they'll also install the irrigation system, especially the supply lines and the lateral lines if needed. After that step is complete, then they'll prepare the soil if the areas need it. Then they'll move on to planting. And then they'll fine tune or install any last irrigation pieces that need to be done. And lastly, they'll install wood mulch or gravel in between the plants where there's bare soil. There are professionals that will take your project from start to finish if your budget allows, but other ones will help you with the phases that you need help with. For example, if you feel comfortable doing the work of installing a landscape, but you just need help with a design, you can work with a landscape designer to help you with that portion. In addition, if you feel comfortable planting plants and mulching, you can work with a contractor to help you with the installation steps to bring your project up to the point where you can do the planting and the mulching. So there's a wide variety of people that can help you, and don't hesitate to reach out to them and see what services they provide. Keep in mind that the landscape industry is not regulated in Colorado like it is in other states. So landscape professionals do not need to have a license to be able to work in this industry. So when you're investing in a project with a landscape professional, make sure that they have the experience and knowledge they need to help you be successful. One thing you can look for is professionals with voluntary certifications, because they have put the time and effort into earning those certifications to raise their knowledge and professionalism. If they have experience, that can be helpful. And ask your landscape contractors for examples of completed projects and references so that you can verify that they'll be able to help you in a way that's going to serve you well. Here are some of the common landscape certifications that exist within the landscape industry of Colorado. Some landscape professionals have college degrees in horticulture, landscape design, or even forestry. Now, if a landscape professional has a college degree, they have put significant time and effort into raising their professionalism. There are a lot of landscape professionals that don't have a college degree that are very well qualified. They might have a certification from the National Association of Landscape Professionals, or NALP, or the Irrigation Association, or the International Society of Arboriculture, or maybe even the Green Industries of Colorado. But I just wanted to point out some of the common certifying bodies that you would see from reputable organizations in our state and nationally. So now that we've talked about working with a landscape contractor, let me share with you a few practical tips to help you get started on your projects. Working on your landscape can be such an exciting and creative time. It's definitely an opportunity to explore your goals and dreams. As you're going through this process, make sure that you are determining how you want to use the various areas of your yard. This will be very helpful to you because you'll build your landscape design around those functions that you want to achieve. Now, for most people, the front yard is simply going to be adding curb appeal and enhancement to the visual aspect of your home. That's very common. But in the backyard, that's where you can really start to incorporate different types of uses into your yard. So talk with your family and start to narrow down the ways that you want to use your yard. Maybe it's a play place for kids or dogs. Maybe you want to have a vegetable garden, or maybe you want to attract pollinators and birds. Maybe your dream is to have a fire pit where you can invite your friends and family over, or a place to dine outdoors, or just simply relax. Maybe you want to incorporate some fruit trees to experiment with that type of gardening here in Colorado. So before you start the design process, it is helpful to determine your top 3 or 4 uses that you want to achieve so that you can start to build your design around those functions. Another thing you can do before you start the design process is to look at your site conditions. This is where you want to take note of your yard size and shape, see which areas have sun or shade exposure, take note of any slopes, determine the elevation of your home, and then start to understand what type of soil you're working with. If you just start to inventory and get a sense of all of these characteristics of your yard, it's going to help you as you start to make choices down the road with the design and installation process. Another thing you can do is start to collect ideas from landscapes that you like. So you might want to drive around and take pictures of landscapes that appeal to you. You might want to begin collecting images from online sources or magazines, but also check out waterwiseplants.org, because that's where Colorado Springs Utilities hosts a photo gallery of local water-wise landscapes. And these are all photographs of real landscapes that have done really well in the Colorado Springs region, and it's free for you to use. Another suggestion is to visit our demonstration gardens for ideas. Colorado Springs Utilities hosts 2 demonstration gardens. The first one is located at 2855 Mesa Road, and that's where we have 2 acres of demonstrations and information to help you determine how you want to landscape your yard with water in mind. The second garden that we have is the Cottonwood Creek Garden, which is right in front of the Cottonwood Creek Recreation Center at 3920 Dublin Boulevard. Both of these gardens are open during daylight hours every day of the year, free of charge for you to visit. Another thing you can do is begin to develop a favorites list of possible plants at waterwiseplants.org. At this website, we have a database of over 400 plant possibilities that thrive in the Pikes Peak region. So this is a great resource for you to determine what plants grow well here and can handle our erratic weather of Colorado Springs. As I mentioned, you can make your own favorites list and share it with other people, so it's a great resource for you. Lastly, make sure that you check out our other webinars because that's where we're going to be sharing much of the how-to steps to take your project from start to finish. We have webinars on design, plant selection, installation of low water native grasses, and how to create a low maintenance yard. And we'll be posting webinars throughout the growing season. In addition, we have landscape related fact sheets and videos available at csu.org. I hope this webinar has been helpful and inspiring to you. Thank you for joining us, and I wish you the best with all of your landscaping projects.